Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is McKaylee. I work at Tattered Cover Bookstore, and first and foremost, I want to say thank you for joining us. I am a blonde-haired, white-skinned woman with short hair and a round face, wearing a black shirt with a polka dot collar. Behind me is a tanned wall with a tan bookshelf and several Harry Potter Pop Funko pieces on it. And a couple of random artworks. Leona's laughing at me, but it's very true. They are on proud display there. Before I go any further, I want to also let you know that closed captioning is enabled should you want it or need it. There's a black bar at the bottom of the screen with a button labeled CC on it. If you click that button, closed captioning is enabled should you want it or need it. There's also instructions in the chat as well. And I want to let you know, anybody who has not heard of Tattered Cover Bookstore before now, we are a local independent bookstore in Denver, Colorado. We have 4 locations, soon to be 5. We're opening up our children's location in Stanley Marketplace in Aurora for those local to the area later this summer. We're very excited for that. So thank you for your continued support, because without you, that wouldn't be possible. And what else wouldn't be possible is the amazing events we have. We've grown this virtual community, and we're so grateful for you all for being able to do that. And so we have many virtual events. You can check that out at tatteredcover.com/event. And there's so many more coming up. Like next week, Lee Tran is the author of the memoir House of Sticks, which is an incredible memoir about her journey as a Vietnamese woman and her family's expectations. So check that out, as long as many of the others. I think we have over 40 in June. But now the event tonight that we have, I'm very excited for this one. We are celebrating Their Plant Eyes by Leona Godin. And then she's going to be in conversation with John Cotter. And so just a little bit about our guests here tonight. John Cotter is the author of a memoir, Losing Music, forthcoming from Milkweed Editions and Under the Small Lights, winner of the Miami University Press Novella Contest. His essays, theater pieces, and fiction have appeared or will appear soon in the New England Review, Rotterdam, Georgia Review, Electric Literature's Recommended Reading, Washington Square, Book Forum, and Commonweal. He teaches at Lighthouse Writers Workshop in Denver, Colorado. And our author of the hour tonight, Leona Godin, is a writer, performer, and educator who is blind. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Playboy, O, Oprah Magazine, and Catapult, where she writes the column A Blind Writer's Notebook. She was a 2019 Logan Nonfiction Fellow and has written and produced 2 theatrical productions, The Star of Happiness, based on Helen Keller's time performing in Vaudeville, and The Spectator and the Blind Man, about the invention of Braille. She found the online magazine Aromatica Poetica as a forum for exploring the arts and sciences of smell and taste, not specifically for, but welcoming to blind readers and writers. She holds a PhD in English literature from NYU and has lectured on art, accessibility, disability, and technology at NYU's Tandon School of Engineering, Rice University, and the American Printing House for the Blind, among other venues. And it's my honor to welcome Leona and John. I'm going to change the camera so that it will be focusing on the 2 of them here. Hello, welcome the pair of you.
Hello. Thank you so much, McKaylee.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Well, I'm going to hand the event over to you all. We are going to be doing a Q&A later in this session, but for now, John, Leona, take it away.
Excellent. Hi, John.
Thank you for asking me to come and talk to you today.
You betcha. So for our blind brothers and sisters out there, we'll just do a quick little image description. I am a white woman with long brown hair and some very nice purple sunglasses today. I'm wearing a black t-shirt that's actually a Their Plant Eyes t-shirt that has a little bit of John Milton's quote. That's where the title of my book comes from Paradise Lost. And behind me there is a purple wall. Some call it mauve, but a purple wall, we'll go with that. And a kind of a wooden nook with some flowers and my book, just my book, prominently displayed.
I am a white guy in his 40s who is shambling and bespectacled. I'm wearing a denim shirt that is loosely opened, an extra button. Actually, I'll close that up now. And I'm sitting in front of extensive library, only a very, very small fraction of which I've read. But I have read this book, which I'm holding up right now, Their Plant-Eyed Personal and Cultural History of Blindness by M. Leona Godin. And it's exciting to be able to talk to her today. So the book is so interesting. It's filled with such interesting. You can't teach that to writing students. Just like be interesting, be interesting, interesting stuff. And the perspective and the voice is so fresh and so accessible. And I thought I would start by talking about fresh and accessible hot button topic. I thought we could rehearse some 17th century epistemological questions.
Oh, fantastic. All right. Start me off easy, John. Thank you.
Your subject is you're a scholar.
I mean, start the audience off easy. Yes, it's a very accessible 17th century, right? We hope.
Have all sorts of accessible hot button 17th century epistemological going on in here about tabula rasa and what we perceive. Who is Molyneux man? What is the Molyneux problem? And what? Because I thought this was so fascinating. I'd never heard of this guy, of the writer Molyneux in the book before. I was so fascinated by this question. And what does it teach us about the way our brains interpret the world?
Yeah, so I came to Molyneux or however you might pronounce it, through John Locke. So one of the sort of big philosophers of the 17th century in England. And he wrote a book called Essay Concerning Human Understanding. And so he wrote this book about how we think and about how our perceptions kind of are formed in the mind rather than in the sense organs. And so William Molyneux reached out to Locke after the book was published. I think it was originally published in like 1694 or something. I'm not very good with dates. And then Molyneux wrote him, and apparently Molyneux's wife was blind or went blind shortly after their marriage. And so he came up with this philosophical question. And it was, if a man was born blind and he was suddenly made to see, and before he was blind, he was able to distinguish a cube from a sphere by touch, would he, after he was made to see, would he be able to, without touching it, without touching these objects, be able to distinguish the cube from the sphere? So Molyneux said, I think not, right? That the objects have not been connected in the brain, and if seeing happens in the brain, which now we know from lots of brain scans that that's actually true, seeing happens in the brain largely, and that we have to learn to see and make these connections between what we touch and what we see in order to say that this object is a cube or a sphere in these two different realms of sensing. So it was this. So then Locke kind of included that question in his second edition of Essay Concerning Human Understanding. So that's how I came to this Molyneux, what's come to be known the Molyneux man now, just because it's something that really sparked a lot of philosophical questions, but it also sparked very practical endeavors of giving sight to the blind. And so really pretty soon after that question was asked, fairly early in the 18th century, they did their first cataract operations. And so sure enough, the people that were suddenly made to see not only couldn't really distinguish like a cube from a sphere by sight alone, but couldn't really make out much of anything at all, like even say distinguishing their pets, a cat from a dog or something, and had to kind of touch these things each time. And there's this great quote that that I think I stole it from Oliver Sacks, because Oliver Sacks talks about it in The Mind's Eye, but of this boy who was made to see, sort of touching his cat over and over again and saying, okay, Puss, now I know you again, you know, and kind of making those associations between sight and touch that usually we make when we're babies, right? If we have both senses, then we make those connections as babies. And so we don't really think about it. So, you know, it gets buried in all the other things that little babies' brains are learning. And so we forget that you actually have to learn to see.
Yeah, I thought that was so
Yeah.
fascinating. In fact, you tell a story. Don't you tell a story in the book about someone who, I think you said you met him at one point, who his vision was at least partially restored, and he was shown a picture of a cube.
Yes. Yes. So, and this was very recent, right? This is Mike May in San Francisco. He's a San Franciscan entrepreneur, and he was blinded when he was 3 by like a chemical accident. And so he has, you know, a great life, you know, is perfectly satisfying life, is a skier, and has a wife and 2 kids. And actually he just happened to like accompany his wife. So this is, I think, early 2000s, if I'm not mistaken. And he just goes to an ophthalmology appointment with his wife, because I mean, he doesn't go to the ophthalmologist, as many blind people are like, you know, what's the point? You're going to tell me that I'm blind again. Thank you very much. I don't need to pay you for that. So he was just with his wife, and his wife's ophthalmologist said, you know, how were you blinded? And he told him it was a chemical accident. And suddenly they learn that there's this like very rare stem cell treatment that's good for only certain kinds of blindnesses. And one of them are chemical burns, such as Mike had. And so it's really interesting, because I think that, you know, for many sighted people, it's completely counterintuitive to think that a blind person would actually not really be that interested in having an operation to see again. And so I think one of the things that maybe might strike a sighted person is that Mike kind of just goes about his life and is sort of like, like it's kind of in the back of his head. And he's like, okay, well, I don't really know. Like I have a perfectly satisfying life, you know, and plus he was busy and he was starting a new business and all this stuff. So I think it's like 6 months or 8 months go by before he finally says, you know, why not? Why not try this thing, you know? And so he does, and it really makes the whole Molyneux question so complex, because immediately he can see certain things, like he can see color, he can see shapes, like absolutely instantaneously, the way that, you know, it kind of like the biblical, like, now I can see, and the angels sing hallelujah, you know, and like, so certain things popped right into his perceptions. Other things really didn't, like sort of what they call kind of higher level seeing. So for example, recognizing faces, it was very difficult for him, even 6 months, a year later. Reading, very difficult. So, and then that interesting moment that you were first talking about. So, you know, now that we have kind of, you know, brain scans and things like that, you can see kind of what activity is going on. And so they were doing all these tests to understand like how he saw. And so the researcher shows him a picture of a cube. And he was kind of like, it's a square with lines. And this is like 6 months after his operation. He's like, it's a square with lines. He was sort of perplexed by it. And she starts the sphere rotating in the computer simulation. And then suddenly he's like, oh, it's a cube, right? So there was something about the movement that allowed him to see this thing. And so I think what's really important about him, and there's some other examples, I also refer to this Oliver Sacks essay called To See and Not See. But what's really interesting about these instances, to me, is this idea that seeing happens largely in the mind. You know, it's not just a matter of having functioning organs. You know, it's really about your mind being able to process the information.
Yeah. Yeah, you have this great line here. You know, you say there's much in our vision that's provisional, arbitrary, and a matter of custom and convention. And I couldn't help but think, because I'm losing my hearing. I couldn't think that it's true for every sense. Is that
Yes.
we have to be taught how to interpret the world via sense. It's not purely natural. It's just this mess of, and that we also experience it in reverse when we lose that sense. So, I think about how when I hear music, my hearing is bad enough now that I can't interpret the sense the noises are making unless
Ah.
it's a song I already know and someone tells me, and I'll be at a wedding and I'll just hear this undifferentiated mess of noise. It's very
Uh-huh.
annoying, actually. And then someone will say to me, "That's Billie Jean."
And then you're singing along
And then I get it. I can make it make sense. My brain says, "Oh, we know what to do with this. We know how to assemble this."
Yes.
And it starts to assemble the data. And you tell a story in your book about when you were losing
Yes.
your vision and you were having dinner with somebody and you said, "Can I have some of that beer?"
Yeah.
And they said, "That's Parmesan cheese."
Yes.
Mm.
It was even more striking because it was, and actually I was kind of getting chills when you were saying that, because I was like, wow, yes, it's so true. These sensory experiences they're analogous, and that's absolutely true, that like, if in my long years, I mean, I should maybe go back here a little bit and say that much of my book is kind of about the fact that I've been on this journey of losing my sight for basically all my life. So for many, many years, I was a visually impaired person. So it was sort of like I could see a lot. I didn't need help to walk around. I didn't need a cane or a dog, but I couldn't read. I couldn't see details very well. I couldn't usually recognize people's faces, things like that, because I didn't have any central vision. So it was absolutely true that I would recognize objects or places much better if I were already, or people for that matter, if the more familiar I was with them, so that my brain would kind of fill in information. So that the moment you were talking about, I was with my roommate, and we were having dinner, and I said, "Hey, it would have been nice of you to share," kind of indicating this like cylindrical object that I, in my greedy way thought was a can of Budweiser. and he and my two roommates were kind of like, what are you talking about? And I reached out and I touched this cylindrical object, and it was plastic, and immediately my brain like snapped, just like the Billie Jean moment, right? And it snapped and it said, "This is not a beer can. This is a can of Parmesan cheese, a container of Parmesan cheese." And then I could see it. It was like, it's so amazing. So it really is like, it's almost like you need to have these kind of strange moments of missing parts in order to understand that concept, that your
Yeah.
brain is making these objects that we understand.
And you mentioned that even people who have, what we call 20/20 vision, they still have a giant blind spot in the middle of the vision that they're not thinking about all the time, where their enormous
Yes.
nose is, right? And the brain is just filling in all this corrective information, and the brain is flipping that picture right side up that our eyes tell.
Yeah, we see upside down. Yeah, but we don't see upside down, right? And that actually was one of those things in the 17th century, because apparently you can like split open cows' retinas or something, and you can actually see the upside down image. And so that was part of that kind of investigation of the cube and the sphere and the blind man and all that, because it seemed like it was so strange. Like, how are we, turning these images right side up? And there's a man named Richard Gregory who wrote this really amazing book back in, I think, the 60s, called Eye and Brain. And he was one of the first people to kind of really think about what this meant, about the fact that our brains don't really care, that the images are right, left, reversed, or upside down, or whatever. The brain is just making connections, it's just simply making connections between what we know, what we feel, what we hear, and what we see, in order to like give objecthood to things, so
Oh gosh, yeah.
I think I lost the thread of what I was answering, but I hope I answered
No,
it.
it's fascinating. You're right. So people, this happens in everybody's brain all the time. And
Yes,
they're
right.
unfamiliar with it.
Oh, the blind spots. Yes, the blind spots. So yeah, everybody's got blind spots kind of, set out towards the periphery where the optic nerve kind of leaves the retina. And so of course we sort of know about these, like now you've got these wonderful things called like blind spot monitoring in fancy cars and stuff. And I think like when you're learning to drive, I never did learn how to drive, although I did once or twice get behind a wheel, which was not a very good idea. But I've heard that you have to kind of watch out for those blind spots, right? That you have to turn your head in order to make sure that some little kid's tricycle is not behind you or whatever. So, but you don't see them. I mean, and that's really, I think, what you were drawing attention to, right? You don't see these blind spots unless you kind of draw attention to them, usually with like some sort of optical illusion, or it'll be sort of a graph on a piece of paper, some sort of visual trick to make you realize that these blind spots even exist, because otherwise everybody is seeing the world just as if it's complete, right? And so I think that's important for me to say, because a lot of us well, I was visually impaired, but a lot of people who are visually impaired have what are called blind spots. But it's not like we run around thinking, oh, there's like a donut hole in the middle of my vision, or there's like spots in my vision. No, because the brain is totally filling in that information. Granted, like in my case, when I didn't have central vision, I didn't have a black hole in the middle of my vision. But if I tried to focus in on something, I could kind of make myself aware of it. But it was something that I kind of had to trick myself into realizing, because most of the time my brain would just kind of say, oh yeah, this is a complete scene, even if I wasn't seeing all those details.
Yeah, and and the experience of someone with a sensory disability is also in its way complete, right? In that the brain is connecting a full picture of the world, even though even other people is a sense might be absent. Although that perpetuates myths, right? And you talk a lot in this book about how there's this Janus-based idea of blindness, where on the one side, to be blind is people are amazed that you can do this. Oh my God, you can go upstairs on her own.
The daredevil, factor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. On the other hand, people expect that you have this, these superpowers.
Right. Yes. Okay. Yes.
Because there's this, like Daredevil, the character, right? Because there's this idea that the blind, and you explore this early on in the book as a trope or a meme, right? That you see has perpetuated its way, through literature, like Tiresias, the Blind Seer. This idea, that or like the Cyclops in the movie Krull, who can see the future, but only the moment of his own death.
Right.
And you talk about how about how one or another of these myths is often in play, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you've experienced these sort of myths I know personally, when I started losing my hearing, people would come up to me and say, your other senses must be so much better now. Are you finding that you just have such a magnificent sense of taste? And I was like, well, better than yours, man. But no, but really, no. How do you address that subject in the book, and what what is it you want to communicate about that?
Well, first of all, I'm so relieved that it's not only blind people that get this whole, like, your senses must be so much, your hearing must be so much better. And I think that, man, there's so much to say about this, but yes, a big part of the book is kind of negotiating these like really wild oscillations between sort of kind of fetishizing blindness on the one hand, with the sort of the blind prophet, the blind poet, so sort of like Tiresias and Homer, and then more modern versions of that, which is like the daredevil factor, right? These superpowers that come in the form of either knowledge or understanding or artistic abilities, or just kind of like being able to like hear heartbeats from 3 blocks away or something, so kind of fetishizing blindness on the one hand, and then really pitying and maybe even being a little bit afraid of or awkward with an actual blind person in your midst, and that both of those kinds of reactions, I guess, to the idea of blindness or blind characters or actual blind humans, doesn't really speak to the blind experience at all. You know, it's not based on an actual blind person's experience. It's all about like, what does the blindness mean to the sighted person? And in literature, it has everything to do with like the sighted protagonist, right? But I think it's kind of true just in an everyday sense as well. It's like, sort of what does blindness mean, right? As opposed to what is the experience of a blind person, right? And because there's just so few blind writers out there able that have had the ability to have a kind of a wide audience to create these tropes, I feel like we've been stuck for like 3 millennia in these cited constructions of blindness, and it makes it very difficult, I think, to kind of negotiate the world, because either there's like extremely high expectations and extremely low expectations, and there's kind of no sense of like being a normal blind person, like
Right.
just, you know, having a normal life with blindness is
Right.
almost unheard of.
Yes, right, because we're such a romantic culture, and it's so interesting to me when I was reading your book to think of you as, you know, because you're a scholar of 17th and 18th century literature, and this is such an Enlightenment concept. You know, this idea that we need to see this thing for what it is, that we need to understand it. You know, I'm using the visual metaphor. We need to understand it for what it is. You know, for actually what it is, instead of loading it down with either received ideas or romantic ideas.
Yes. And you know, the only way that that's going to happen really is just allowing for there to be more blind creators. And I mean that in the widest sense, you know, writers, scientists, researchers, you name it, right? Script writers, directors, maybe, you know, I mean, everything that you could possibly think of, in order to kind of recalibrate these ancient ideas, you know, this kind of ancient wild oscillation, you know, and I, you know, I do think that there needs to be a little bit of kind of a stepping back, because there's just so many blind characters out there, right? I mean, you basically can't read a, you know, a science fiction book without there being like a blind seer in there somewhere, you know, that's gonna set the protagonist on their correct path, you know. And I think we just need to kind of just step away, allow for some recalibrations, so that we can have some real lived blind experience to kind of fill in that huge gap between those two, you know, maybe diametrically opposed ideas of like the amazing blind person and the pitiful blind person. Like there's a lot in between, you know.
Absolutely, which you certainly do, and which you undertake part of that journey in your book. And I learned a lot in the book. You know, one of the things that I keep thinking about is Helen Keller's time in vaudeville, which I didn't know existed. Right? I think maybe a lot of people, I sound like Trump. A lot of people haven't, you know, I've been hearing more and more about it, right? Like, but a lot of people didn't know about Helen Keller's, I feel like, in vaudeville. And I when I was reading about Helen Keller, and you're fascinating on the subject of Helen Keller in the book, it makes me want to read Helen Keller's books. I think about, you know, this internet meme that I told you about when we talked on the phone that time, that this idea,
yes,
there's all these people on Twitter who think that Helen Keller didn't really exist.
Yes.
Who are Helen Keller truthers.
Yes.
And
you know what, I'd heard about it about Stevie Wonder, that there's that about him, and then you're the first one to tell me about that. And then since we talked that, you know, a few weeks ago, it was like, oh, yep, there it is. People are talking about the Helen Keller truthers. It's like, it kind of makes my heart palpitate a little bit, because it's just like, wow, how do we even, I don't even know how to kind of wrestle with that kind of segment of the population. It's so hard, because it's like, I mean, then everything can come into doubt, right? I mean, it's just how do you fight that? I mean, all I can say is that I believe that there was a Helen Keller. I've read all her, you know, I've read, I think, all of her books, and it certainly feels like she was a real life flesh and blood person. It'd be quite a feat. I don't know, maybe we should send them to like the Helen Keller archives. I think it's American AFB, I think, has a huge archive of, basically Helen Keller everything, so it would be quite a feat to kind of have manufactured, rooms and rooms of pictures and letters and everything. So I guess that's what I say to the Helen Keller truthers. But I guess to the other side of it, it does speak to the idea that I think I say it in the very beginning of chapter 1, where I talk about Homer, and there's this kind of there's this really funny quote that right away, like, we have this idea of like Homer being blind, and actually that's not even the issue, because actually Homer, we really don't know if he existed or not. I mean, it was,
oh yeah,
a couple thousand years ago, so there is doubt there, but it's funny because the doubt is also kind of related to his blindness. So there's this really funny quote that I quote from like a Roman scholar who basically says, well, to me, the people that say that Homer was blind are actually blind themselves, right? Because he wrote more beautifully about the visual world than anybody else. I mean, I'm totally massacring Proclus, but he's been dead a long time, so he won't mind.
Later massacred him.
Yeah, but that doubt, right? This is really what I find so worrisome, is that doubt that a blind person can kind of speak intelligently about the world, because I think people think of the world as being just entirely visible. That doubt, I mean, that even haunted Milton, his critics. I mean, even up until like T.S. Eliot was like, yeah, there's really no visual imagination in Paradise Lost, which I definitely spend some time kind of arguing that, but I guess it kind of relates to that, right? That like, if Helen Keller really did everything that they say she did, then she must have been a fraud, right? I mean, I think that's the kind of bottom line issue. It's like, no, you cannot, because I cannot conceive. I mean, it's not only ocular centric, but it's egocentric, right? It's like, I can't conceive doing these things that she did if I didn't have sight and hearing. So that must mean it's not possible, right? And I mean, that's really where you get into trouble, is that kind of like, I can only understand the world from my own perspective, and then to make like grand sweeping judgments based on that very limited perspective that everybody has, so
yeah,
man, you can tell it gets my blood boiling.
No,
sorry.
It's not like the moon landing, which is of course fake. This is
and the earth is flat. Yes, telling that to people in Denver, right?
Right. A credulous friend who believes every conspiracy theory, and I said to her one time, "You probably think the moon landing was faked," and she said, "This is true." She said, "I believe the second one was real."
Oh, wow.
It's such a wonderful answer. Well, but I think this is our last question before we go. This is all we have time for before we go into audience questions, which I'm excited to get to. But you talk in the book about how this kind of incredulity greeted Helen Keller in her lifetime as well, or not incredulity alone, so much as people would credit, even the people who did credit that, okay, she had all these sensory disabilities, these sensory impairments, but that's all we'll allow her to be. Right? Whereas in fact, she had all kinds of ideas about capitalism, about race relations, about romance, right? All the affairs of the heart. And she wanted to talk about these things, and she wanted an outlet to talk about these things, which vaudeville to some extent provided, because she was able to kind of, let it all hang out. But you've talked about how, and you've said that some of the other, blind or visually impaired writers that you've talked to have described, and I've certainly experienced, how people, even when they credit your experience, when they credit, okay, well, a lot about not having a sense, but we don't want you to know about anything else. What is that phenomenon in your experience, and when have you encountered that?
Yes. Well, I mean, the first time I kind of realized that was a problem was actually in Helen Keller's her book called the world I live in, the world I
Mhm.
live in. So that was sort of just a few years after The Story of My Life, which everybody reads in school, right? And The Story of
Mhm.
My Life is a great book, but she wrote that when she was like 22 or something. I mean, she was so young, right? And she lives to be 87, so she had this whole life after Story of My Life. So it makes me so sad that, people kind of don't get beyond that kind of miracle worker Story of My Life section of her life, which basically ends when she's 7, right? So the first time I kind of encountered this idea, this how should I say it? This kind of pushing a person who is different to writing memoir and not really wanting to hear what they have to say about the world is actually beautifully put in her preface to The World I Live In, because she basically says, the editors are, so kind that they must be right, in telling me that like everything that I have to say about the affairs of the world, and she names some things that were big in her time, but some of them will sound kind of familiar, because she even mentions, sort of the conservation of our natural resources, right? And this is in 1908, so she was super hip. I mean, that's all I can say. She was super hip to ideas that we're still battling it out, right? I mean, race relations, women's rights, you name it. She was definitely a lefty, woohoo. And but they didn't really want her to write about that. They wanted her to write another memoir, and so that's what the world I live in is. It ends up being a very interesting memoir, because it's all about how she does perceive the world. And this gets back to that idea of doubt too, is that, when she comes to talk about smell and how much she gets from smell, she's kind of constantly battling these naysayers in this book that say, you can't learn anything from smell. You can't possibly, like, your whole world is dictated by others, is kind of what the upshot of it is. And you can read the frustration like on every page of this book. It's really great. And it's also very disheartening, because I think it is that kind of that drive to make people, again, who are different or who perceive the world differently, to force them into this kind of memoir mode and not let them out of it.
Right. Oh yeah, and to encourage them to provide what you call in the book, right, and what is often called the disability community, right, inspiration porn.
Inspiration porn, down with inspiration porn, yes, which is, I don't know if you've encountered this yet. You're sort of still a little bit new to disability, right? Am I wrong about that, John, or newish?
I'm new to reading extensively about it. I've had my own experience of it, which is getting on a decade now, although it's intensifying as time goes on.
Yeah.
But I certainly encountered it when I was shopping my memoir around. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Did you feel like it was one of those words or phrases that as soon as you read it or encountered it, you were like, oh my goodness, yes.
I knew instantly would have been it, but people they don't just do it. I mean, it's this impulse. I saw a magazine cover one time that said inspiring lessons from Anne Frank. And I thought, well, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, but probably that's not the most important thing about the story of Anne Frank, right?
Yeah.
And there's this massive push to make it. People told me when I was shopping my memoir around, where's that happy ending? And I would explain, well, there's something that there's a story of adaptation, there's a story of learning, there's a story of and they want the big emotional
and that's such a human story, right? I mean, I do kind of harp on that a bit. It's like adaptation is something that humans, I mean, that's what has made us, for better or worse, probably worse, the rulers of the planet. It's because we are so adaptable, and that it's kind of like, yeah, let's have stories of adapting and learning and growing, and not like, bringing the house down with tears because, I don't know, like you've accepted your disability, and again, the angels sing hallelujah, and it ends. Yeah.
I had to see them with my eyes alone, whatever. Yeah, who knows? Here to pull us out of this despair for the human species we've landed in, McKelly.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. I'm actually thoroughly enjoying the conversation. It's very hard to stop the pair of you. On the podcast. I want to say thank you both, first of all, for your candor and for your really, just like I said, your candor. It's so refreshing to hear people talk honestly about their disabilities and be open about it in this way, in a way that I know I never experienced when I was younger. And I think that this book starts a lot of conversations. It's incredibly informative and fascinating, and everyone needs to make sure that they get their copy of Their Plant Eyes at tattercover.com or at one of our locations. So we're going to move to some Q&A, which if you, there is a chat next to the screen that we're being filmed on at the moment, and questions can be recorded, typed, placed there as you see fit. And so Leona, I like this one to start. We're only going to do a couple here, but this one is why a book for this subject? Having written in so many other formats, why did you feel the need for this story to be in a book?
Well, that is such a great question. And I will say that this book is definitely a mashup of kind of all the ways that I've been investigating a lot of these subjects for, going on 20 years now. So there's bits of like my dissertation that have been reworked as a kind of where we started this conversation this evening, kind of in the pocket of my dissertation, the 17th, 18th century, that have gotten, much more readable, much more accessible since the dissertation. There are the plays that I wrote that, investigate Helen Keller's time in vaudeville and what I called the very sexy history of the invention of Braille, which kind of took place right in the kind of leading up to the, I should say, the education of the blind started in the years leading up to the French Revolution. So sort of tied in with this greater history. So in bits and pieces, much of this book has been explored in other ways. I mean, through essays, through all sorts of things. I felt like it was important for me to bring it all together because I think it's kind of, it was important for me to show all the different ways in which some of these big ideas play out in Western culture for, again, like 3,000 years, I mean, those are some really ingrained notions about blindness that are still with us and ever growing. And I just kind of wanted to be able to put it all into a place that was like, not going to be the ring cycle version of a play about this stuff. So I think I needed the space. I guess that's the short answer, is I needed the space of a book as opposed to a 1 hour play or hour and a half play or a short story or things like that.
Absolutely. No, it's just always a really fascinating question about what draws people to that medium of a book, and we always, given that we are so close to Lighthouse Writers Workshop, we often have a lot of questions about craft and novel writing in particular, or various book writing formats. And we'll take about 2 more questions here, which is another craft question.
Yes.
Is there anything that you didn't get to include in the book that during the editing process that you want to mention now, that you're itching to mention now?
Yeah, what got left on the cutting room floor, huh? You know what? I would have loved, there's 2 kind of reasons why this got cut. I had, so we definitely moved from sort of Homer in this book to modern times, right, to today pretty quickly. So there's so much that gets left out. I would say the biggest thing that got left out that I feel like in the end, I'm probably not the person to write this aspect of it, but I would say connections between blindness and race.
Fascinating.
And there was like this one thing that I came across that just particularly stuck with me. It was that I guess in the 60s, there was a picture of 2 little blind boys, and it became extremely iconic of like, I think, they had like it was a little white boy and a little black boy, and they had their arms wrapped around each other, and it was sort of like race is blind, or blind, be blind or race, or something along those lines, right? And I think that there's a whole nother cultural history that would be so fascinating, that would have to do with like that kind of idea of um, yeah, really not seeing color, and in a very practical sense, I guess, and what that might mean. And I'll say from my own experience, like, because there are so few blind people compared to sighted people. For example, I used to do karate in New York City. This is going to sound so random, but I used to do karate in New York City. And I tell you what, because there was like maybe 20 or 30 of us that did it every week, like 3 times a week, and we got to be really close. And I will tell you that it was absolutely a cross section of all of New York City, right? And really the only things that we had in common was the blindness or visual impairment. So there's something there as well that I would have loved to explore. But just didn't have time. And again, I feel like I'm not the person to tell that story, and that there should be a whole nother personal cultural history of blindness and race or something.
No, absolutely. I think that's a wonderfully valid point. It would be a very fascinating read. And definitely not in the way that Dave Chappelle did it, but something a little bit more serious with the history of it, I think would be fascinating.
Dave Chappelle might be in there too. So.
Honestly, he might be, that would be very true. This last question here is actually for both of you, both you, Leona, and John. For John as a reader, and for Leona as the writer of this book. We love asking this question here at Tattered Cover. So interpret it as you will. But what did this book, Their Plant Eyes, teach you? John, I'd love it if you could start first, and then we'll end with our author of the
I think I mentioned a few. I have a whole list. I mean, it taught me. It taught me about the. I'll pick one. Right, I'll pick one. It taught me a little bit about the invention of Braille, which I'd never really. I'd never thought to look into it before, and about the story. Braille was only partially invented, right, by Louis Braille himself, right? It was an officer in Napoleon's army who made impressions to be read at night. What do you call it? Night writing?
And night writing. Écriture nocturne, yeah.
Yeah, he called it night writing so that spies could communicate messages and read them by hand. And it seems like Braille's innovation was partially simplifying it, making it smaller, and organizing it. And sort of clarifying the alphabet, like Confucius says, clarifying the language, right? That's he sort of clarified the language, and then reading about, and then I was also quite surprised on that note by how few blind people, or people blind from birth, or I guess even blinded later in life, but you'd expect it, I guess, less in people who lost their sight later in life, learn Braille or use it.
Yeah.
I had assumed it was as common as something like ASL. And it doesn't seem as though it is, partially because it seems as though some people have this sort of futurist idea, right? That will eventually people just won't need it. Everyone will just do everything the way. And that's not necessarily true. And I'll be thinking about that. And I'll be thinking about what that means. That's what I did many things I learned in the book.
Yeah. Interestingly, I don't know if this is true. I feel like I just recently heard that actually only 10% of people, there's like an analogous number that like only 10% of people who are hard of hearing know ASL. That actually it is a very kind of small number, unfortunately. And I think there's something analogous there. And somebody can say if I'm quoting that number wrong, because I honestly don't remember where I just heard that recently.
It's probably a higher number in people who are born deaf.
Absolutely. And same with Braille, right? So I think that the sort of powers that be that really urge us to like fit into the dominant culture, they kind of have to kind of roll over when children are born with a disability, and I even heard this from somebody from NFB. He said, well, the teachers didn't really have a choice. Like I was born blind, so they had to teach me Braille. But there's some real resistance to teaching Braille to kids who are like visually impaired, even if it's very clear, that they're very young, like I was, very like 10 years old, and I was already struggling to read. Like, it was pretty obvious that I wasn't going to be able to read, visual print for very much longer. And yet nobody, really talked about learning Braille or compelling me to learn Braille the way that they would compel a sighted child to learn how to read, so and making us kind of go in a direction that's more I guess palatable to the dominant culture. So yeah, I mean, that's a frustration, right? That I think that we need to allow for sensorial difference and not kind of push all the time for, inclusion is a wonderful thing until what we're talking about in inclusion is just an asymmetrical kind of urge to fit in, right? Because I think that can be very detrimental for a lot of blind people and probably people with all kinds of disabilities, that if we're constantly needing to fit in as opposed to like sharing each other's, as opposed to like sharing experience that can be different, it kind of puts us at a constant disadvantage, anyways, that's my small soapbox, but
did you learn writing the book?
What did I learn? And this is kind of related. I think this was such a long journey that it's hard to get my brain around that question. But I think along those lines, thinking about access and thinking about reading modalities, I think it made me very aware of the need in the blind community, amongst people who are visually impaired and blind, to be open-minded with each other, about the fact that we're not all the same. Like, I think it's very, like, we're all kind of aware of the fact that we need to show the sighted world that we're not all the same, that we're not all like Tiresias or Daredevil or whatever. But it's also important for us to be kind, I think, to each other, and realize that it is different to go blind when you're 40 or when you're 10 or being born blind, and that you are going to have like different skill sets, and some things are going to make more sense for your ability to move and manipulate the world, and to just kind of, I guess that's my big takeaway having written this book, is it kind of shook some of my ideas about like what people should do or shouldn't do or should be, and just allowing for those differences within our own community, I guess.
It's really needed in the deaf and hearing impaired community too.
Yeah.
Completely. It's just acceptance that everybody has a different path and different
needs. Yes, here.
Absolutely. Like I said before, I could let the two of you go on for a whole nother hour.
And we would.
Honestly, I feel like a lot of people would listen and enjoy and learn and grow. So thank you both. I want to give each of you a chance to remind people who you are, where they can find you online, and anything else that you want to say before we close out this evening. John, once again, I'm going to have you start, and we will end with our author of the hour here.
Great. I'm John. I write fiction and nonfiction online. You can find links to my work at johncotter.net. And I have a memoir about losing my hearing called Losing Music that'll be out for Milkweed Editions in maybe late next year, maybe early the year before. We haven't scheduled a date yet. I guess until they finish with edits, but it'll become faster than one expects. Probably.
Well, yes. We will host your author event whenever that happens. Let us know.
That's right.
Yes. So my online presence is pretty much across the board. Dr. M.L. Godin, so Godin. So that's .com for my website, and all the ats, at Dr. M.L. Godin for Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all the old people social media, and this has been a complete pleasure. Thank you so much, John, for a really fun conversation. You have a radio announcer voice. It's quite magnificent. And thanks to Tattered Cover and everybody for being there today for their plant eyes.
Absolutely. And you can get their plant eyes at tatteredcover.com or at any one of our locations. And those of you who ordered the book with us ahead of time will be mailing those out very, very soon for you. We thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Leona, John, if you'll stick with me as I close out here. I'm McKaylee at Tattered Cover Bookstore. Thank you all for shopping locally and keeping your money in your communities. It means more to us than you will ever know. And it keeps us around, especially during this global crisis that we are working our way through. And we thank you all again. Stay safe, everybody. Happy reading. Good night, all.
Bye.
And we're out. The live